the end of the chapter, Genesis 30, 25 through 43. And as you can see on the screen, the title of today's message is God Not Scheming. God Not Scheming. Well, let's read through the passage. Genesis 30, 25. Now it came about, and microphone is on. Now it came about when Rachel had borne Joseph that Jacob said to Laban, "Send me away that I may go to my own place and to my own country. Give me my wives and my children for whom I have served you, and let me depart, for you yourself know my service which I have rendered you." But Laban said to him, "If now it pleases you, stay with me. I have divined that the Lord has blessed me on your account." He continued, "Name me your wages, and I will give it." But he said to him, "You yourself know now I have served you, how I have served you, and how your cattle have fared with me. For you had little before I came, and it has increased to a multitude, and the Lord has blessed you wherever I turned. But now, when shall I provide for my own household also?" So he said, "What shall I give you?" And Jacob said, "You shall not give me anything. If you will do this one thing for me, I will again pasture and keep your flock. Let me pass through your entire flock today, removing from there every speckled and spotted sheep, and every black one among the lambs, and the spotted and speckled among the goats, and such shall be my wages. So my honesty will answer for me later, when you come concerning my wages. Every one that is not speckled and spotted among the goats, and black among the lambs, if found with me, considered stolen." Laban said, "Good, let it be according to your word." So he removed on that day the striped and spotted male goats, and all the speckled and spotted female goats, every one with white in it, and all the black ones among the sheep, and gave them into the care of his sons. Of 3 days' journey between himself and Jacob fed the rest of Laban's flocks. Then Jacob took fresh rods of poplar and almond and plane trees, and peeled white strips in them, exposing the white which was in the rods. He set the rods which he had peeled in front of the flocks in the gutters, even in the watering troughs where the flocks came to drink, and they mated when they came to drink. So the flocks mated by the rods, and the flocks brought forth striped, speckled, and spotted. Jacob separated the lambs and made the flocks face toward the striped, and all the black in the flock of the flock of Laban. And he put his own herds apart and did not put them in his flock. Moreover, whenever the stronger of the flock were mating, Jacob would place the rods in the side of the flock in the gutters, so that they might mate by the rods. But when the flock was feeble, he did not put them in, so the feebler were Laban's and the stronger Jacob's. So the man became exceedingly prosperous and had large flocks and female servants and camels and donkeys. What can I say? More drama, huh? It seems wherever Jacob goes, and mind you, this individual is 91 years of age at this particular point. That's how old he is, where we find him in this story. He was 77 when he came to Laban, and he stayed there. He's worked for 14 years now, is where we find him. So 77 and 14 is 91. But he continues to scheme, doesn't he? He continues to kind of plan and to try to manipulate things and try to arrange things just in such a way that things work out his way. So God is still continuing to work on Jacob and continuing to teach him there. So where are we today? Well, where we are today is God just opened Rachel's womb, is where we kind of left it off in verse 24, and she finally bore a first son to Jacob, named him Joseph, And so now Jacob has 11 sons and one daughter, and that's where things are. And he had worked for about 14 years for Laban. You recall the original agreement was Laban said, Jake, name your price. And Jacob said, I want to marry Rachel, your younger daughter. And Jacob said, I'll be willing to work for you for 7 years for the hand of Rachel. Laban said, deal. So Jacob works 7 years. Laban switches on the day of the wedding. Jacob discovers the following morning that the switch had been made. Laban said, it's not our custom to give away the older before the younger, and the younger before the older. I apologize. And so basically kind of forces Jacob's hand to work 7 more years. So what started out being 7 years ended up being 14 years. Jacob, in God's providence, God is allowing Jacob to get a little taste of his own medicine, isn't he? He, remember, the reason he left his house in the first place was because he had schemed so much that he had deceived his aging father, probably wasn't in great relationship or in great, talking situation with his dad. And we know how his brother felt about him. He said, I'm going to kill you. As soon as dad passes, I'm going to kill you. So God allows Jacob to leave. He needed to get married anyway. He's 77. It's about time, right? And so he leaves to go find a wife. And now God allows him to start experiencing a taste of his own medicine, where he actually comes upon a Khan who is on the same level with his own Khan. And so now his Uncle Laban, is allowing Jacob to kind of experience some of the same thing. And so 14 years, Jacob has finally finished that, what started as 7 turned into 14. And that's where we are in verse 25. He comes to Laban and he says, and that's the first point, by the way, if Thomas, you can go to the next slide. Jacob completed his service and asked to be released. But Laban, blessed by Jacob's presence, wanted him to stay. That's the first point there, and that's in verses 25 through 28. He's finally worked for 14 years, and he says, basically comes to Laban and says, it's time for me to go. I have been your servant. I have kind of not felt like a free man. I have, basically everything that I have earned, everything that I've made went to you to pay for the hand of your 2 daughters. And so now he is ready to be released. And even with that, if you think about it, he still doesn't have anything of his own. He's worked for 14 years. He's worked for Laban, and he has nothing on his own to show for it for the last 14 years of work. But he's ready to go. He's ready to go. What does Laban do? And that's kind of subpoint A, is Jacob asked to return to his country. And so as Jacob reminds Laban that it was time to take his wife, and he's seeking his release so that he can return to his homeland and his family. We probably can't know all of the ways Jacob felt toward Laban, right? And that's 2A on your screen. Probably at this particular point, Jacob's thoughts toward Laban probably were not very positive based on kind of his experience with Laban, right? He had been deceived, and his return had already been delayed 7 years longer than was expected. So Jacob probably had certain thoughts towards, and they probably weren't the most positive. Laban, however, as Jacob comes to him and asks him to return to his country, Laban, subpoint B, 2b, Laban understood that God's blessing of his possessions was tied to Jacob's presence there, and so he wanted him to stay. So in verse 25, 26, Jacob comes to Laban, my wives and my children, for whom I've served, and leave. Let me go home. Let me go back to my country so I can establish my own family, in a sense, away from you, away from this servitude. In verse 27, Laban says, stay with me. I have divined. That probably means that he used whatever form of basically searching God's will, or searching God's thoughts. And what he had figured out, basically, in a very clear way, was that his increase in wealth was very much tied to Jacob being there. And that's why Laban is reluctant to let Jacob go. Laban had come to enjoy his prosperity. He became wealthy because Jacob was there. And so Laban is thinking, if Jacob stays, it would probably be on the basis of some kind of a profit motive. So Laban is trying to talk Jacob into staying. One of the cool, I think, interesting points here is what Laban realized. Laban realized that the blessing of heaven rested on Jacob. We talked earlier about how, there's a lot of drama that kind of follows Jacob. But you have to realize, and we have to remember something, as we step back from that, God had called Abraham and gave him a promise to create a nation out of him. That blessing was passed to Abraham's son Isaac. And now that blessing had passed to Isaac's son Jacob. So later, when the Israelites prayed, when the Israelites talked about their God, they talked about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So that's who Jacob is. Jacob is a key person in the history of Israel. And so that's what Laban kind of realized, is that the blessing of heaven rested on Jacob. And Laban realized that his stock had wonderfully increased under Jacob's management. And in a sense, I think that's a kind of a remarkable testimony that good men are blessings to the places where they reside, right? We, God's man, are blessings to the places where we reside. Men of the world are often blessed with temporal benefits on account of their pious relatives, though they have not always, like Laban, the wisdom to discern or the grace to acknowledge it. You and I are not only called to be the light of the world, but God blesses others on account of our presence there. Isn't that neat? I mean, I just think it's really wonderful how God works. And we saw that clearly in Genesis 19, where God was willing to forego judging the entire city just on the account of a very small number of righteous people in it. And that's how it still works to this day. And so I just think it's kind of a neat story there. And so then as we kind of continue to, in this story, Laban is basically saying, what is your price going to be? And that brings us to 2C. Laban agreed to pay whatever price Jacob would name for staying. Laban understood that things were different now, and he would have to actually pay something real, like a real salary, not a part-time intern student kind of pay that he was given Jacob up until now for these last 14 years. Now, the eastern shepherds receive for their hire a lot of times not money, but a certain amount of the increase or produce of the flock. And so that's kind of the normal custom there. And that's what Laban was asking here. He was basically saying, name me your wages and I will give it. And that brings us to the second point. Jacob and Laban agreed on payment, and Jacob stayed, becoming very rich in spite of his schemes. Jacob and Laban agreed on the payment, and Jacob stayed, becoming very rich in spite of. Brings us to verses 29 to 43. What's Jacob doing here? Laban says, name me your price. Well, Jacob is actually being very wise in the way that he negotiates here. At first, he strengthens his position by underscoring in Laban's mind the value that he would be to him. How does he do that? Well, he just basically reminds Laban of what had happened and how God had blessed Laban since Jacob was there. Jacob now had a family to provide for, and so his wages have to be adequate to meet their needs. Jacob has to think of the future, and so Laban's offer, Jacob basically suggests, is going to have to be a good one. And so that brings us to 2a, which is Jacob's price was all the future rejects out of Laban's flock, and it was accepted. Jacob's price was all the future rejects of Laban's flock, and it was accepted. Now that Laban is prepared to accept a hard bargain, Jacob names his terms. And probably when Jacob related his terms, Laban probably sighed a sigh of relief because the request seemed to be very easy to accept. Now, you have to understand something. In that part of the world, normally the sheep were white and the goats were either brown or black. That's kind of the norm. So it wasn't uncommon for the sheep to have, stripes, or for the sheep to have spots or whatever, right, on them of different color, or for the goats to be anything other than brown or black, or to have, various other colors. That was usually an exception rather than the rule. That was, and they were considered kind of almost like a second rate. That's why I said the rejects. They were the rejects. They were not the norm. They were not the kind of the majority of what the flock consisted of. And so that's what Jacob asked for. And there's a little bit of unclarity here in the text, I think, and I'm not going to try to clarify it much, but it seems that what Jacob is asking for, having kind of set up the terms and explained to him that, to Laban, that, he now has a family to provide for. It seems that what Jacob is asking for in verse 32 specifically is he's saying, let me go through the flock and let me pick out all the rejects. And that's going to be kind of pay, as well as, obviously, whatever future rejects, if you will want to call them, continue to call them that way, are going to be produced by your flocks. And so Laban thought, well, Jacob is not asking for half of my flock. He's not asking even for a quarter of my flock. He's just asking for a very small exception. Fine, I'll do it. And then Laban, the old schemer, the old con, what does Laban do next? Well, Laban very quickly does something to prevent Jacob from getting a whole lot, or that will put even an extra element into there that will keep Jacob from really getting anything. What Laban quickly does is he goes through his flock and he removes all the speckled, all the sheep that Jacob had asked for. He takes them out and removes them out of his flock. And Laban sends his sons out with removing these speckled sheep and goats, and he puts a distance. He sends his sons, and they travel for 3 days. They walk for 3 days distance away to where they are far away from the rest of Laban's flocks. What does Laban do? Well, as soon as he agreed to this deal, he immediately tries to make the odds completely in his own favor and against Jacob, is what he's doing, by removing all the animals that were the type that Jacob asked for outside of the gene pool, is what he's thinking. So not only is he not honoring the part of the agreement where it appears very much in the text as if Jacob says, can I start out with what is speckled, and then I'll have those, as well as whatever they produce, if they produce, speckled and non-white sheep and non-black or brown goats, that will be mine. Anything that is not will be yours. And the same for the main flock, for the flock that is white, whatever their offspring is, if it's speckled or basically looks like a reject, it'll be mine, and if not, it'll be yours. And Jacob said, it'll be really easy to make sure that we're both honest. He said, if you come and examine my flock, anything that you find within my flock that is white or that is black or brown, that's a normal color, he said, that'll be considered stolen and I'll be held responsible for it. So that's kind of the deal. But again, as I mentioned, Laban immediately schemes as soon as he agrees to the deal and tries to lessen the odds, tries to make the odds not in Jacob's favor by removing all of these speckled sheep out of his flock, sending them 3 days away, and letting his sons kind of take care of that flock. Well, what does Jacob do? Well, Jacob basically decides to scheme. That's what he does. And he responds, I guess, in kind. And so he does a couple of different things, and he schemed to manipulate the outcome, but it was God who allowed Jacob to become rich. What does Jacob do? There are different explanations for what we read as far as what. Couple of things. Some of the branches of the trees that he puts in front of the sheep, one of the explanations for that was that it was possible that some of these plants had the ability to bring or to move the estrus period forward to where they would start ovulating or being in heat faster. That was one of the explanations of the possibility of the combination of the trees and the branches and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, basically Jacob had made some observations. You have to remember, he had been now pasturing Laban's flock for 14 years. He had learned a thing or two. And so as a result of that, he, I guess, thought that maybe if he can plant or place some of these speckled or whatever, whatever he was trying to produce, he thought that he would place that in front of the mating sheep or goats, that would somehow impact the type of offspring that they would have. Again, there is various amount of evidence, but at the end of the day, there's really no clarity that had any kind of real effect. What we do know with clarity is that the two guys, both Laban and Jacob, as soon as they had a handshake, both went out and immediately started trying to kind of increase the odds in their favor. Laban immediately removed the speckle. Jacob is trying to do these three things here in order to increase his flock. What are the three things he was doing? Verses 37 through 39. The first method that he used was he used peeled poles, which were supposed to have some kind of prenatal influence on the flock. And he supposed that if the flocks had a visual impression of stripes while they were mating and conceiving, the offspring would assume this same form. That's the first thing that he did. So all about the trenches, which served as the watering troughs, Jacob placed these peeled poles, and every appearance would incline him to believe that his scheming was working. The second phase of what he did was he tried to predispose the outcome of his labors, was segregating the flocks. The striped, speckled, and spotted offspring were put off by themselves, and the rest of the flock was faced toward those animals, which were either striped or all black. While the peeled poles were artificial, the striped animals were the real McCoy, and surely by seeing these animals, the rest of the flock would get the idea. That was the second thing that he did. And the third thing that he did, this third phase, it was kind of selective breeding. We're told that lambing took place twice during the year, once in the fall and once in the spring. And so those born in the fall were thought to be hardier, since they must endure the harsh winter. And so Jacob placed his peeled poles only in front of the superior animals and not before the weaker. In Jacob's mind, The result was that the strong animals went to him while the weak ones went to Laban. So, just kind of reading this text, the first appearance of this text seems to be that the great prosperity of Jacob in verse 43 was due to his shrewd techniques for manipulating the outcome of the mating of the flocks. So it would seem. And so it seemed to Jacob. There's only one problem, though. That's just human manipulation. Zero evidence that that's something that could actually work. The real reason and that Jacob became as wealthy as he did has nothing to do with Jacob's manipulation. It has nothing to do with the branches or the trees or which way they were looking. The real reason is only one, and that is God. That's the real reason. And you're like, well, where are you getting that from? I mean, how would you say that? Glad you asked that question. Look at chapter 31. I want to show you this. We're kind of jumping ahead. We'll look at chapter 31 next week. But look at chapter 31 today. And what's going on in chapter 31 is Jacob is now hearing, as a result of him becoming super wealthy, Laban's sons are grumbling, and Laban himself is not as friendly. And so Jacob, and then in verse 3, the Lord said to Jacob, return to the land of your fathers and your relatives, and I'll be with you. So Jacob sent, verse 4, and called Rachel and Leah to his flock in the field and said to them, I see your father's attitude, that it's not friendly toward me as formerly, but the God of my father has been with me. You know that I've served your father with all my strength, yet your father has cheated me and changed my wages 10 times. However, God did not allow him to hurt me. If he spoke thus, the speckled shall be your wages. Then all the flock brought forth speckled. And if he spoke thus, the striped shall be your wages. Then all the flock brought forth striped. Thus God has taken away your father's livestock and given them to me. Who did it? God did it. How do we know? Jacob tells us in chapter 31. And so we have clarity just a few verses later that it was God. It wasn't Jacob's manipulations. It wasn't his scheming. It wasn't all of the things. Despite or in spite of all those things, God was the one that blessed Jacob. God, and that brings us to the third subpoint under the second point. God ensured that what he worked for. God ensured that Jacob got what he worked for. And that's exactly what we learned in chapter 31. We're told that the real reason for Jacob's prosperity is God, not Jacob, God. And I want you to get this really well in your minds. Jacob did not prosper because he pulled one over on Laban. Jacob's success was not the product of his schemes. It was the product of God's blessing in spite of Jacob's schemes. And here comes a point that I think you and I need to really learn, and it's a great and encouraging point out of this story as well. You know what the point is? Often in life, we feel taken advantage of. We feel like we work really hard and someone else gets the credit. Someone else benefits or reaps the fruit of our labor. And in those kinds of situations, kind of like Jacob here, he worked really hard for Laban for 14 years. And what did Laban do? Well, the text tells us that 10 times, whether that means literal 10 times or whether that means a whole lot of times, what Laban did is he said, no, your payment's going to be this. No, your payment's going to be this. No, your payment's going to be this. We know that he didn't increase Jacob's payment. Jacob wouldn't be complaining if Laban kept increasing Jacob's payment, because that's called promotion. No one complains about that. What Laban did instead is he kept decreasing, right? Over and over and over again. And Jacob is probably what Jacob is doing here at the end of chapter 30 is he's saying, for all those times, for all the situations in the last 14 years when you tried to take advantage of me, Laban, I'm going to show you what taking advantage looks like. And so he is trying to kind of correct things and fix things. But the cool part about this story and about what we learn in the next chapter is that it's God who actually saw things all along. And this is what makes this passage such an incredible reminder, is that God always knows and he cares and he makes things right in his perfect time, doesn't he? That's what God did for Jacob here. Where was God when Jacob kept getting taken advantage of time and time again? 10 different times. Where was God? He was there. Did he know? He knew. Did he do anything at the moment? No, he didn't do anything at the moment. But when the right time came, of his schemes. And so I think it's a really good reminder for us that sometimes in this world, especially today, world in which we live, everything around us, everyone around us, the world will constantly tell us, you have to get out there, you have to take care of number one, you have to assert yourself, because if you don't, no one else will. And if you don't go out there and assert yourself, you'll be easily taken advantage of, you'll be easily squished, you'll be easily stepped on, and so you have to go out there and fight for yourself. And I'm not saying don't go out and fight, but I am saying make sure that you pray and make sure that you leave and lay your request before God, because ultimately he's the one in charge of the world. He has the hearts of the kings, the heart of your boss, the heart of other people who may be scheming or who may be wanting you something bad. He has all of those hearts in his hand. And in the right time and in the right way, in the way that only he can make sure to bring things right. He can make things that have been going so wrong right, just like he did for Jacob. God ensured that Jacob got very rich, not for any other reason other than that he knew that's what Jacob worked for. And he knew that that was what was due, what was owed to him, because of all the ways and times and situations in which he had been taken advantage of. So I think that the lesson here and the big idea here is very simple. Aside from what we just said, those who experience material prosperity must acknowledge that it is a blessing from the Lord and not the product of their own limited abilities. Those who experience material prosperity must acknowledge that it is the blessing from the Lord and not the product of their own limited abilities. That's really what it boils down to. In addition, like I said, to the fact that when we feel taken advantage of and we feel like God is not there and God does not care or God does not see or God is not doing anything in the moment, we just need to keep on praying and keep on waiting and keep on expressing our feelings to the Lord. And when he blesses, and he does, he will, when he blesses, we also need to make sure that he gets the credit for that. And we need to remember that his blessings are because of his grace, and all of the talents, all of my talents and all of my abilities are really in the first place given by God, and they're empowered by God. And so the story is a wonderful reminder of that, is that God gives us what he wants to give us at the time that he wants to give it to us, because he knows and his timing is perfect. And that reminds me of another passage. You can check it out when you get home. Ecclesiastes chapter 3. The first 11 verses of that chapter are really interesting. And it's a great reminder of the fact that God has perfect timing. You know, he has perfect timing for everything. In fact, after the first 11 verses, after all the listings of the different time, there's time to embrace and there's time to not embrace, there's time for this and there's time for this. And at the end of those 11 verses, at the end of all of that reminders that the author gives us about the different times that God has created, there's a wonderful kind of a recap of all of that. And it says this: he has made everything beautiful in its time. That's the recap, is that God, if we just allow his time to work out, he has made everything beautiful in his time. And that's really the story that we're seeing with Jacob. I think that had Jacob not tried so hard to do it his way, to ensure that things went the way he wanted them at the time that he wanted them, he would have still benefited from a lot of the blessings that God had given him, but probably bypassed a lot of pain, a lot of unnecessary pain, a lot of suffering. And that's kind of how things work out in our lives as well. So let's learn from Jacob, and let's bring our requests and our needs and our frustrations to God and allow him to work things out in his time. And when he blesses us, let's not forget to remember that it is his blessing and it comes because of his grace. And let's make sure that we give credit to where the credit is due. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for this reminder from the life of Jacob, a reminder that you are there.